Hi modern historians, I'd like to now take you on hopefully a quick journey through understanding this period of what's called liberation and the early days of the Communist Party of China's consolidation of power. So really we're talking about roughly the end of the Second World War, in our terms 1945, the end of the Second Sino-Japanese War, 1945 as the Chinese call it, and the coming to power in October 1949 of Mao and a declaration of the PRC. Look, when we're getting our head around this phase in a very quick way, I'd like you to take on board the following characteristics. It's the second phase of the Civil War. The Civil War, of course, starts around 1927, continues until there's a united front against the Japanese in 1931. It goes through the period of 1934, the Long March, and the myth building around that and the importance of that event to Mao and the Red Army and what becomes known as the People's Liberation Army. Then we have our second united front against the Japanese after 1937. The war continues against the Japanese, and the second phase of the Civil War is 1945 to 1949. So when we're getting some of the key characteristics here, and I'm popping them up now, firstly, 45 is the end of World War II, the end of that Sino-Japanese War. This is an important contextual clue to what's going on. We need to remember that it's this time that the Kuomintang, sometimes referred to as the KMT, Kuomintang, are defeated first in the north and then further and further to the south. And there's some really fabulous animated maps online that can give you a sense of how areas fall in sequence, where the major battles were, and so on. Ultimately, we need to recognise by 1949 or in 1949, the Kuomintang's leadership, Chiang Kai-shek and others, retreat with their remnants of their army to Formosa, an island off the coast of southeastern China. That country there in Formosa, or that island there today, remains the Republic of China. We often refer to it as Taiwan or even Chinese Taipei. All of the events we're talking about in this video here are against the context of the early days of the Cold War, which we're going to look into in more detail in later units of this year. And it's also a period of time when Mao Zedong is growing quite close to the Soviet totalitarian dictator Joseph Stalin. So let's break down a little bit more detail on each of these. As you know, World War II ends with the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on Japan by the United States. The United States is the predominant force in the world as the world's only superpower with atomic weapons until 1949. But at the same time, there's a sense of the United States wanting to remove itself from the conflicts of the war, to demobilize their giant armies around the world. This coincides with a reduction of military support to the GMD, okay? And that reduction of support accelerates as the GMD ceases to have effective control over large portions of China. It's the time in which the world's second large revolutionary communist nation is established, the People's Republic of China. Mao Zedong thought is at this time in 1945 written into the central principles, the core principles of the Communist Party of China, sometimes called the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP or the CPC. Don't be confused by that one. Those key principles of Mao Zedong thought remain there for quite some time. The Civil War is a war that is incredibly violent. In a sense, all wars are. But it's a war that's won by siege and atrocity, by starvation as a weapon and so on. And some of our key locations here are Changchun, which is in Manchuria, right up in the north. Beijing has a 40-day siege around it. Nanjing, the capital of the GMD. Shanghai, Chongqing, one of the last strongholds of GMD land or territory in the Republic, or what was the Republic of China. It's about to become the People's Republic of China. As The GMD is defeated. The People's Liberation Army, the Red Army, expands in its numbers. Troops totally switch over from being GMD troops to CCP troops without even a change of uniform at times. There's the equipment of the GMD, the tanks, the weapons, the artillery, moving over into the hands of the communists. And so obviously the People's Liberation Army, the Red Army, become increasingly powerful, and they were always very important within the Communist Party. So while the GMD leadership and what's left of its army evacuates, many of their supporters are left behind. They don't follow their leaders to Formosa, Taiwan, the Republic of China. Many of them hold jobs in government departments, in police forces, in schools, throughout China. They don't just uproot their family, they remain behind. So the Chinese Communist Party, taking power in October 1949, inherits a lot of the civilian administration, the police administration, the military officers and so on of the GMD that's still on the mainland. This then raises the question of how loyal are the government services, the government officers, the people that the PRC now needs to run the country as a communist state. We see from a very early time suspicion of rightist. Remember, communism, Marxism, socialism is a left of centre political doctrine. So what we're looking at here is a suspicion of rightists who are remaining. These possible future counter-revolutionaries, those who are not truly won over to the cause of communism, but rather are there because there is a new power in charge of China. There's a sense that the Communist Party needs to maintain its hold on power, but they have an internal threat among them. We can then overlay that with the Cold War context. We have increasing international tension between the United States and the communist world, led largely by the Soviet Union. The United States sees itself as a counterforce, a counterbalance, a defensive force against international expansion of communism. They're seeing this expansion happening in Eastern Europe under the Soviet Union's invasion of places like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary. And they're seeing an expansion of Chinese communists, first in China itself, but of course also into areas like Tibet, which are quickly invaded. There is this clear tension between the United States and USSR, and that ideological and military tension will now extend towards China as well. China, as a communist state, is worried about a hostile United States supporting its enemies, sending in spies, undermining the new communist government of China. And of course, this is the eve of the Korean War, Korea on the border. It's not too long before the United States and China are actually fighting against each other on a battlefield. During this period, Mao visits Stalin in Moscow, and he's greatly impressed at the advances that the Soviet Union has made under Stalin. He particularly is impressed by the Soviet Union's modernization campaign, industrialization campaign, his collectivization of agriculture in the Soviet Union, and sees these as the foundation of Stalin's success in defeating Hitler and the Nazis in World War II. He sees this progress in the Soviet Union as something that China should emulate. He's also, of course, impressed with Stalin's cult of personality that's grown up about himself. So the People's Republic of China joins with the Soviet Union in a block of nations. And there's a slight typo there. A treaty of friendship with a P, of alliance and mutual assistance is formed. And the People's Republic of China joins into a nation, and that seems to be doubling up there, with the Soviets in hostility towards the United States. So let's now put a few themes in here to consider. Perhaps ignore those little typos on the end there. In this period, we have a real centrality of violence to Mao's rule emerging, and it continues through all phases. There's the importance of the Red Army being established, and the People's Liberation Army is another name for that. Figures like Lin Biao, the commander of the People's Liberation Army, become important from this period onwards. There is a deep fear within the Chinese Communist Party of a resurgent GMD. They're fearful of the hostility of capitalist nations, including the United States. There's a desire to secure the gains of 1949 and to not let this hard-fought civil war victory disappear and evaporate. They want to make sure that those gains cannot be undone. Something that comes up when you're doing reading around this topic is that the revolution, the liberation, is in itself an incredibly violent event. That the revolution is violence, according to Mao, and liberation is actually, in fact, conquest. Let's now have a look at what Mao has to say about the importance of violence and warfare. It is central to his thoughts, and you might pick up on some of these quotes that while they come from Marxist.org, they're useful in understanding what Mao has to say about warfare and its importance to the communist Marxist movement. He goes on to say, and I quite like this quote, "Revolution is an antitoxin that eliminates the enemy's poison and purges us of our own filth." Warfare, violence is central to Marxist, Maoist power in China. He actually has this very famous line that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. He sees warfare as the highest form of revolution, and he's saying that without this type of struggle, the Communist Party would have no standing in China at all. So it's a very important period. Take a moment now, and I'm going to hit pause just for a quick moment. Take a moment now to have a look at these sources that grow out of Chongqing, the biggest siege in the first part of this period in Manchuria. So take a moment there, and I want to do a reading for you in a moment to wrap this up. So hopefully you've paused there, have a sense of what you're looking at. We've got a New York Times column talking about what happened in Chongqing. Quite disturbing, the reports there. We've got a Chinese Communist Party propaganda poster regarding Chongqing. You can see the GMD flag here, which is the flag of Taiwan on the ground. And we've got our Red Army troops raising the red flag of communism. There's not many very effective photos coming out of this period, but both of these photos here are of the siege of Chongqing. We've got the advancing Red Army troops on the outskirts of Chongqing here, and the victory parade as the flag is actually raised in Chongqing. The gentleman here in the uniform is Lin Biao. And Lin Biao is famous for saying, "Turn Chongqing into a city of death." So just very quickly, I'd like to read you just a couple of lines from Dakota, who says, "When workers in Changchun started digging trenches for a new irrigation system in 2006, they made a gruesome discovery. The rich black soil was clogged with human remains. Below a metre of earth were thousands of skeletons closely packed together. When they dug deeper, the workers found several more layers of bones stacked up like firewood. A crowd of local residents gathered around the excavated area and was taken aback by the sheer size of the burial site. Some thought that the bodies belonged to the victims of Japanese occupation during World War II. Nobody except an elderly man realised that they had just stumbled upon the remnants of a civil war grave that had been resumed after 1945, or the civil war that had resumed after 1945 between Mao and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. In 1948, the communists laid siege to Changchun for 5 months, starving out the nationalist garrison stationed inside the city walls. Victory came at a heavy cost. At least 160,000 civilians died of hunger during the blockade. After liberation, the communist troops burned many of the bodies in a mass grave, or in mass graves without so much as tombstones, nameplates or simple markers. After decades of propaganda about the peaceful liberation of China, few people even remember the victims of the Communist Party's rise to power. And they are the opening words of Dakota's The Tragedy of Liberation.